Welcome back, everyone, to this final panel of the conference, which is about green macro policies. I'm very pleased to join by three distinguished experts. Michal Horvath from the National Bank of Slovakia. He is the senior economist there. Davide Panzerl, who is the senior policy advisor of ECHO, which is an Italian think tank on climate change. And Shahin Vallée, who is the head of the geoeconomics program of the German Council of Foreign Relations. And let me also mention that Shahin was also working from Bruegel a couple of years ago, and he made many great contributions. Now, this afternoon, we will focus on the macroeconomic dimensions of climate change, both on what climate change implies for the conduct of macroeconomic policies and macroeconomic developments, structural changes in the economy, but also on what policy, mainly macroeconomic policy, should do to foster a sustainable development and the green transition, which is sustainable from all kind of aspects. I mean, certainly a very important aspect is environmental sustainability. I mean, that's one of the core issue. But there are also a couple of other dimensions of sustainability which should also be considered. One is social sustainability, because I mean, certainly, for example, fiscal policy can raise environmental taxes to high levels. That would be good for the environment, but might not be socially acceptable to voters. And also fiscal sustainability is also a crucial issue, because climate change might impact economic developments adversely. We will discuss this issue. So GDP might be lower in the case of a more severe warming scenario. And also a lot of public spending might be needed to tackle challenges related to climate change, which might lead to increases in public debt. So I would also suggest that public debt sustainability is also a very important issue that we should consider. Now, I asked the speakers to offer some short initial remarks, and after that we will have a conversation, and hopefully we also have a conversation with the audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please go to Slido, so slide.do, sl.do, and then type EGD as a keyword, and then you can ask questions, and I have a device here next to me in which I will monitor the questions, and I will ask those questions in the second part of our discussion. But first, let's get going, and let's start from the broader picture. So we would start with Michal Horvath, and my question to you is what is the broad picture? So how could climate change impact the macroeconomy? I think that's a very important question. What kind of structural changes would you foresee in the years and decades to come to respond to the challenge posed by climate change? But also, what should fiscal policy, how much investment would be needed to tackle the challenges? What part of that investment should be public investment? What part should be private? So if you could elaborate those issues, I would very much thankful for that. So Michal, the floor is yours now.
Yes, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be a part of this panel. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so my remarks are going to have two parts. The first one is pretty much talking about the obvious, about the macroeconomic implications. And then I'll have some preliminary policy considerations. Of course, other speakers will have more to say on that later on. So when it comes to macro implications, we need to think about the macro implications of climate change itself, and then also about the macro implications of the policies that are aiming to address climate change, so the transition towards a low carbon economy. When we talk about the impact of climate change, if I were to sum up the sort of state of current knowledge as far as I know, is that these impacts are uncertain but potentially very large. And also there are potentially very large downside risks if the policy response is inadequate or delayed or just simply late. So that's why if you take kind of a robustness approach to this sort of challenge, then effective and timely action is very much needed. To go a bit deeper into climate change, so obviously people, the question is what will it do to levels of standard of living, so GDP or consumption or whatever. And here there is an interaction between a very interesting interaction between risk and levels of GDP. So the climate change dramatically, significantly affects the uncertainty that we face towards the future, with potentially more frequent sort of large destructive events affecting different bits of the world. And there is also uncertainty about the degree of risk involved, and all these things do have an impact on people's decisions, possibly even today already, even though we talk about definitely a longer term process. Generally, when we talk about large and severe events, people tend to think about destruction of sort of physical things, capital, as we call it in economics. But we also have to consider that after disasters, there is loss of hours worked as well, and then also people working on things that they otherwise wouldn't be working on. So diverting activity from more productive uses to just simply sort of cleaning up the mess. And so these are of course first order effects if something happens. But the uncertainty that these things might happen in the future do have an impact on investment well ahead of this. So all these things have to be taken into account when we think about the macroeconomic consequences. And it's not only the volatility in the real economy, as we call it, but also we need to think about prices, inflation, bigger volatility. I mean, partly we're going through this today already when think about food prices and different parts of the world suffering from drought and so on. It already has an impact on inflation in globally, but these things can get a lot more severe and pose problems. Now, when it comes to transition policies, so we need to take action, but that action also has macroeconomic implications, and hopefully overall the implications are going to be sort of favorable. But we have to be aware that a lot of what we have to do simply to address climate change is what we would call a supply shock. So something that sort of dampens economic activity and at the same time increases prices. Whether we talk about a carbon tax, we talk about regulation, or even sort of markets for pollution. All these things, they make some things more expensive and at the same time impose a cost on economic activity. The good news is that if we do this gradually, then the costs might be contained. If we do not do it gradually and end up, acting too late and have to take harsh measures, then the consequences can be very significant. Of course, and I guess this is what today's debate is going to be largely about. There is an investment side to climate change as well, where currently the amounts invested into environmental protection by governments are very, very small as a part of public investment, kind of up to 0.5% of GDP in EU countries. So these are and very often around zero. So these are very tiny amounts, and we obviously have to do more. So these investments have a potential to increase both economic activity, but also the potential of the economy, and for that reason could be a sort of a net positive for the without inflation raising economic activity. So in that sense, they could be very good things for the future. So I already started talking a bit about policies, and without preempting what will follow after my intervention. I was just trying to gather some thoughts about how one would think, as an old-fashioned macroeconomist, how you would think about. Not that I'm an old-fashioned macroeconomist, but if I were an old-fashioned macroeconomist who looks at the economy from a helicopter view, not thinking too much about sectoral policies and so on, how you would think about this. One can, with some degree of simplification, think about climate change transition as a special case of a structural reform agenda. It's a special case for all the reasons that I mentioned. Failure has potentially big costs. It's not like messing up education reform a little bit or something like that. So the consequences here can be devastating. But it's for our discussion, it's probably useful to think about it as a kind of a structural reform program. And so it kind of follows from that and I guess a large part of the central banking community, which I happen to be a part of now, tends to think about climate change as where the role of monetary policy is limited. This does not mean that the role of central banks is limited or zero, but when it comes to the actual monetary policy, there are more effective, better tools to address these challenges. And but I don't want to talk about monetary policy, as all central bankers. I like to talk about fiscal policy more. So when it comes to fiscal policy, today's discussion is largely about whether we should have different rules to face up to this challenge. And I should say, when you think about this as a structural reform agenda, we already have experience with augmenting fiscal rules to kind of incentivize structural reforms. We've had that within the Stability and Growth Pact in Europe in the past. I remember the days in the 2000s when many Central European countries had exemptions from various bits of the Stability and Growth Pact if they were implementing pension reforms. So it was the costs of pension reforms used to be taken into account in the Stability and Growth Pact. We've also had some accommodation of both structural reforms, but also investment in after the great financial crisis. There were all kinds of clauses then. Flexibility clauses imported into the Stability and Growth Pact in order to promote a growth-friendly recovery after the great financial crisis. There's experience with sort of rules of that kind outside the EU. In the UK, they have the Sustainable Investment Rule, where explicitly public investments were sort of treated outside the operational rules for fiscal policy. The question is now, looking back, how has this worked, and whether what the lessons are for climate change. My humble assessment would be that these attempts did not work that well. And I'm not sure what the lessons for climate change are, but the experience so far with mixing sort of debt sustainability and potentially counter-cyclicality with some structural goals hasn't worked exactly as we had expected. Sometimes it was basically just an ex post reward for good behavior to people who otherwise would have done that reform or investment anyway. In which case it just made the system more complicated without any significant impact on the incentives. You could also say that it can be subject to abuse. So when you start separating some classes of expenditure from something else, then there is always a push to reclassify things in the direction that makes it politically convenient. So that is another lesson in this regard. Yeah, I keep wondering why this and how this would work in today's world.
Now, I think we will come back to that issue after Shahin and Davide, because they both talk about fiscal aspects. So I think it naturally leads to Shahin. And my question to you is what are the main fiscal implications of climate change? I mean, first of all, more broadly, I mean, should that imply a restructuring of public revenues and expenditure, and if so, to what direction and what sequencing? And more specifically, which also Michal already started to talk about, the fiscal rules. Currently, there is a official review of European fiscal rules. I mean, the European Commission has just relaunched about a month ago a public consultation of the European Economic Governance Framework, listing 11 concrete questions, and one question especially deals with the issue whether European fiscal rules should consider sustainable development and sustainable transition. So Shahin, both for the more general impact of climate change on public financing and more specifically on EU fiscal rules. So what's your take, please?
Well, I only have 5 minutes, so I think I will leave you with 5 questions that are very high on my mind, and to which I only have very partial answers. The first question is, how much investment is really needed to face the climate and energy transition challenge? And I have to say, on this, economists have come up with some estimations, but if we're honest, these estimates are very rudimentary. And I think there is still quite a great deal of uncertainty about how much transition really costs. And one, I think, important source of that uncertainty is, when does the transition really start? Because potentially if you start late, the costs increase, and they don't increase in a linear fashion, they potentially increase exponentially. So I think the whole question about how much investment is needed, to me, is a question to which economists have only partially responded. The second question is, how much of that investment is public and how much of that is private? And I think in your paper, Zsolt, and in others, economists tend to talk about investment as though public and private investment were perfect substitutes. And I think that's wrong. I think we need to do a bit more work on how much of the investment for energy transition has to be public, because it deals with critical energy infrastructure that are public in nature. And I think that also differs from one country to the next. If you have a grid that is very decentralized, you can afford to have very private-led investment. If, on the other hand, you have a grid that is very centralized and that is dominated by nuclear energy, like it is the case in France, I think the investment will be public to a large extent. And so I think the question of the share of public versus private, to me, is still a question that is not answered fully. The third question is, how do we adapt our fiscal framework to respond to these challenges and needs? And I think on that, we don't have a consensus, that we don't have a unique way of looking at this. Zsolt and Guntram have made a proposal to the ECOFIN, which I thought was very useful, but you could think of a range of other options to create fiscal space within the current framework. One would be, to create a proper green golden rule. The other would be to create a vetting mechanism for green investment, a bit like we are doing with the RRF. And so I think, that could, potentially lead to very profound changes up to the fiscal framework. And I think that will be part, or that should be part, of the conversation around the reform of the SGP that is ongoing. I think once we have that, to me, a fourth question, which I think is central and which I think the current proposals don't really respond to, is how do we make this framework able to respond dynamically to our emissions reduction path. Because today we estimate that our emission reductions should be X, and as a result, the public investment should be Y. But how do we create a system such that in 5 years' time, for instance, if our emissions reductions are falling behind, we can adjust our rules-based framework accordingly without, rewriting the entire rules. At the moment, if we say, for instance, let's create a golden rule that guarantees 0.5% of GDP of green investment, maybe that sounds right today, and maybe that will sound too much in 5 years' time, or maybe that will sound wholly insufficient in 5 years' time if we realize that we're actually way behind on our emissions reduction path, and we need to have 10 times the investments that we thought we needed today. So I think having a system that is dynamic is very important. And to me, one way of doing that would be to include in the European semester and in the fiscal governance framework the national climate and energy transition plans that each member state have to submit every year. And in that submission, that we would have an evolution of our emissions compared to the target. If we find each year that we are behind schedule, that should mean we should increase the pace of our investment. So we should have a system that is dynamic. And maybe we should have a system that mutualizes our emissions quota as well, so that we mutualize investments, such that, for instance, if country A has not invested enough, maybe that quota of public investment can be used by country B, such that there is kind of a positive feedback loop and an incentive for every member state to invest as much as they should in order to meet their emissions reduction target. And the fifth question I would like to leave you with is, we've talked quite a bit about national fiscal policy and how national fiscal policy can evolve. But I think there is a real question also about how do we create European instruments. And I think we have created a precedent with the RRF NGEU that is a precedent that, should be used in the future. So maybe in 5 years' time, or, 3 years' time, when this NGEU RRF is finished, maybe we should think about creating a new instrument, a climate fund, to use a word that was used in the German coalition agreement, and fund this climate fund through common borrowing and direct European spending in that direction. So I'm just opening that question and bracket, because I think of course national fiscal policy has to play a central role in climate and energy transition. But not only that, I think European fiscal policy should play a role too. And these are my 5 questions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Shahin, also for keeping the time. And I think indeed the 5 questions you raised are really, really essential. But let me come back with a quick follow-up question, namely, what's your expectation that if there will not be any change to the fiscal framework in EU, because now you also mentioned a couple of options on how to foster green investment, but it's still at this stage, it's quite uncertain. Some countries express views that the rules are as good as they are. There should be legal certainty. We shouldn't change the rule every time we face a problem with compliance. So what's your take? If rules will remain unchanged from 2023, would that adversely impact public green investment? So in other words, do we really need to change the fiscal rules, or instead, let's say, go for a climate fund or something like that you mentioned?
If you tell me that we cannot change the fiscal rules, but we can create a new 1 trillion euro climate fund at the European level, I'm okay with that. But I don't think it's easier to create a 1 trillion euro climate fund than it is to change the fiscal rules. And because I think the world is very imperfect, I would rather try all avenues at the same time and see how far we can get with each and every one of them. So maybe we'll get an insufficient reform of the fiscal framework, and maybe we'll get an insufficient European climate fund. Maybe the sum of 2 insufficient policy responses will be better than just one or the other.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Now, Davide, let me turn to you, because you prepared a concrete proposal on how to foster green investment. Could you please elaborate your proposal?
Yes, thank you. So the proposal that we as ECHO prepared alongside and in cooperation with economist Pia Saraceno, which will be available, let me plug it, in the next couple of weeks. Basically, it takes its start from the reflection around the green golden rules. But even before then, I think there is a step back reflection which I think is relevant to make here, and is the fact of why we are in a situation of discussing whether the Stability and Growth Pact is compatible, allows the investment, the green investment and the transition, or whether it doesn't and it needs to be reformed. And this step is the realization that effectively the climate models and the macroeconomic models that exist do not interface, and they're not integrated. So basically our fiscal policy is based on macroeconomic models and analysis that do not integrate the climate risks. Which basically biases the structure upon which the Stability and Growth Pact, for example, is based on an idea where you see the costs of the transition as immediate and as very high, as has been mentioned already today. But at the same time, you don't see the costs of not doing the transition, which are perceived as far away, as unquantifiable and not immediate. And therefore, this, I think, is one of the reasons also why we've got a delay with climate action worldwide, because obviously it seems that a slow, steady progression with climate intervention is better for avoiding or spreading the costs which are immediately perceived. And now, obviously, there's nothing wrong, and in fact, this, as has been mentioned, is good that there is a steady progression, so we don't have jolts of any sort. But the pace, I think, is driven by the urgency, which I think current macroeconomic analysis doesn't fully reflect. So I think the longer term solution would be, as recognized by, for example, by the ECB and other international actors, is to integrate these analytical models. However, that ECB has decided, set the 2024 as a deadline for producing this. In the meantime, though, and this brings the discussion to the relevance of the Stability and Growth Pact and its review, we shouldn't let economic rules and economic and fiscal policy, which has been set on the basis of models that do not account for these climate risks, it shouldn't stop, or it shouldn't hinder this transition, which we are seeing and the financial market are recognizing as bringing its impact more and more visibly and more tangibly. And they are coming now, and they are coming again, as Michael mentioned. We don't know, we can't quantify them yet, but I think we've got a pretty good idea that they are becoming more frequent and more important. So the need to reform the Stability and Growth Pact. The discussion has been in the literature, obviously, and it is and it will be focused on whether it's flexible enough, whether the constraints are arbitrary or whether they're based on fact. But I think, and I agree on this, that with what has been said, that basically there is a need to, and this is the focus, that green expenditure is considered, and this is coherent with the green golden rule, is considered outside of the Stability and Pact rule. So it's not impacted and is not constrained by rules that are made and do not consider, when they were made, the full impact of the climate risks. And this is based on there's a very important consideration, because obviously one of the arguments of the fiscally more conservatives is that obviously we've seen the debt grow recently with the COVID crisis, and that the debt to GDP ratios are unsustainable and do not create enough fiscal space for for the transition. But I think that this is actually should be seen as the opposite. The costs of not doing the transition are much, much higher than actually doing the transition. So it does actually make a fiscal sense to do this investment, to allow this investment in the green transition, because that is what makes the debt more sustainable in the long term. And as I alluded to earlier, already the markets are considering this and pricing this in, and they are increasingly seeing the adverse climate events not as bad luck, but as bad management, which means that being seen as not taking sufficient action to mitigate, and especially for adaptation, because you don't make the funds available, or because you can't or you don't want to, actually creates a bad impact and a cost from the market, which see your sovereign debt as less sustainable. And coming to the green golden rule, which I agree, it definitely goes in the right direction. But has been mentioned before, there has been a focus on investment, which is what the green golden rule wants and aims to make as a special category and with special rules. I think that should be expanded. That investment in itself is not enough. Expenditure and debt should also be set aside in this green expenditure category, not just investment. And this is because there's two crucial elements to the transition. One is demand incentives, and the other one is the mitigation of social impacts. The importance of both is recognized, amongst others, by the EU in the Fit for 55 package through the creation, for example, the Social Climate Fund. Without expenditure in those, the transition cannot happen, and especially it cannot happen with the pace and the ambition that we know it's necessary. Partly because, and we've mentioned the carbon price as a driver for change and for expenditure. Yes, that is very important, but if at level of general public, we're talking about electric cars, electric heating, for example, to bigger ticket items, you need the initial investment in order to switch from the fossil fuel-based technology to the greener technology. In order to have that, not everyone can afford it. So unless you intervene with incentives, you have a lot of people who are trapped in a spiral of debt, because obviously you've got increasing costs on the one hand because of the carbon prices, which are passed on to the consumers, and at the same time the inability to pass to greener technologies, because you don't have, the cost is too high to begin with without the incentives and the help. And the just transition, because obviously the transformation has huge and important benefits and opportunities, but also costs in terms of job losses in the industry that are going to be replaced. Important policies are needed in terms of education, requalification of the workforce, but also there is a part of creation of new green jobs, but also there is a part of the old workforce which for a number of reasons cannot be redeployed. So you need social mitigation in order to ensure that doesn't create unemployment with all the problems that it has. So you need these things, and you don't need these things just because, however important it is for social justice. You need these because you cannot have a transition without these elements, because otherwise you'd have fierce opposition, you'd have a perception of we are bearing, which wouldn't be wrong, we are bearing the costs of the transition and we can't afford it and we're being left behind. And on the contrary, where you've got a transition which works for everyone, and you've got incentives, and you have a very fast or sufficiently fast transition from fossil fuel-based technology to greener technologies, you also have multiplicators and benefits in terms of growth, which again, in turn, makes the debt more sustainable. So the overall argument is that without because obviously mitigation of social impacts and demand incentives can't be classified as investment. This is expenditure. It can be in the context that we are with the debt to GDP ratios that we're seeing. This is likely in large part to be financed through debt. But without debt, the transition cannot happen, and without transition, the existing debt is unsustainable. So actually, it makes economic sense to allow debt to be included in this special green category. Which brings to another point which has been made, which is that of the risk of abuse, which is obviously a big risk which we have seen and we are seeing. And one of the reasons why the fiscal compact was created in the first place. So obviously this green expenditure wouldn't be a free pass or a loophole so that creative governments could include absolutely all sorts of expenditure which is not classified as green. And as has been mentioned, I think that one idea, one of the proposals that we are making in the paper is that there should be strict conditionalities and that countries should present a roadmap that shows the coherence of this green expenditure with the long-term strategy, for example. So the coherence with the transition, listing the interventions, showing the coherence with the transition, showing the ability of these interventions to sustain growth, monitoring the effectiveness with clear indicators, include interventions aiming at mitigating social impacts, and the whole economy should push in the same direction. So again, one of the conditions should be that, for example, ordinary taxation should be reformed and should be made coherent with this wider transition, so that again the benefits of growth can be reaped at best, and there is nothing within the economy, or as little as possible, that rows in the wrong direction. And it should be a clear and strong governance structure to ensure that this opportunity is not wasted and that the milestones are met. These roadmaps should be submitted similar to what we've seen with the national recovery plans to the Commission, approved by the Commission and monitored by the Commission. Where there is not compliance, then the Commission should recommend corrective action, partly because, as been mentioned by Shahin earlier, we effectively non-compliance is obviously a problem, because it undermines the transition, and it should be possible to monitor this ongoing, because we don't know yet what the technologies are going to be. We don't know yet what the solutions are. So the ability to be flexible, as Shahin was saying, and to change things, to change the course of these action and this expenditure as we see how the impact that they have, how effective they are, what new technologies come online. I think it's crucial to avoid being fixed with a plan that is then proven 5 years down the line to be no longer fit for purpose. So the ability to review and to effect corrective action, I think this is crucial in having these plans. Should corrective action not be taken or not be effective, then the relevant or abuse should abuse be detected, then the relevant expenditure should be taken out of this special category and put back into the general wider category, which is still subject to the Stability and Growth Pact. However reformed, because the purpose of the paper is not to discuss exactly what reforms other than the special category of green growth, of green expenditure is to be created. By taking the penalty of doing that, so the penalty of abusing this rule or not being unable to make effective corrective action, is obviously the negative impact on the perception of debt risk from the markets. So this is a brief summary of the points of the paper. So the proposal of an extended green golden rule to include debt, but with strong conditionalities.
Thank you very much, Davide. I think you raised a number of excellent points. I mean, starting from the differences between climate models and macro models and lack of their integration into some of the specifics of possible golden rule, which would also, I think, many people would very much welcome if indeed the national climate plans would be included in the annual cycle of economic policy coordination in the EU. Now, let me raise one question which is very clearly related to what you have said. This was asked by T. Wing, who asked that what happens if markets do not discriminate between traditional public debt and carbon transition financing. So basically, they just see that the public debt is going up. Could that lead to an increase in the risk premium? Who would like to answer this question?
I'll let the other experts answer and add to my answer. But I think that the point is that already markets are not doing that. Markets are already very alive to the climate risks and to the damage that it can bring about. So effectively, what we are proposing here is also to help markets to discriminate effective action and allowing effective action, climate action, which in turn would lead to a more sustainable long-term debt. I think markets are very much alive to the discrimination. And I think it wouldn't be in their interest to not do that.
Now, my question, whether we talk about the debt of governments, like comparing Germany and Italy, for example, or the debt of companies which don't do themselves, some of them do more to achieve carbon neutrality, others do less. Because for governments, I think the picture is more complicated. And at least at this stage, I don't really, first of all, I don't really see any clear indication, how much of a country's public debt is financing green and non-green projects. And I think currently more the macro type of developments drive the risk premium, at least in my view. So basically the question, if you go back to the market assessment, when the market realize that a particular country is doing too little to climate, and it's also, can you put, in a more bigger dimension that, whatever a country is doing in itself, it's minor compared to the global challenge of climate change. Even if the EU does everything it can, I mean, EU emission in global emission is just around 10%. So even if the EU goes to complete carbon neutrality, still the world continues to, and the rest of the world continues to pollute. So I'm still indeed not very really sure that markets would be the best mechanism to discipline countries. But maybe some of the other speakers, do you have a view on the role of possible market discipline and what would happen if just public debt goes up because we exempt in one way or another certain expenditures from fiscal rules?
Can I jump in quickly? Because I think it's partly this question, but the earlier, some of the points also, I think, highlighted the importance of EU level action. I think I don't think it's very productive to discuss this topic at the national level or the level of national governments. I know a lot of the procedures and frameworks within the EU are set up in that way, but this is really where action from the center is instrumental and almost irreplaceable. Or it's an externality problem. EU is a collection of small open economies. Even if you adjust individual models of countries, you're not going to get anything out of that because it's to a large extent these are exogenous events to small countries. This calls for it is a coordination problem and it calls for coordinated action. And so that's why when Shahin was talking about the climate fund and so on, I think this is the way, this is the direction the thinking should be going. And then also the question of finance, once there's something like a climate fund or something and it goes to the markets, it's more or less clear, like it is today with the sure bonds and whatever, what the purpose of spending it is. And they do, these bonds, they do trade at a premium at the moment. So markets are sort of rewarding, or the preferences are such that these instruments are traded at a different price from the from general supranational bonds or other sorts of sovereign bonds. So I think that thinking about this at the EU level solves so many problems at the same time.
Just a quick comment. I think it's a very important question to think ahead of how markets will react to large amounts of debt that will be issued for climate and energy transition. But as Davide was explaining, our models today to measure debt sustainability are purely anchored in macro and not anchored at all in climate and energy transition. But if we combine these two logics and dimension, maybe markets will see that actually, there are two sustainability metrics that are important to have in mind. One is the typical, macro debt sustainability analysis, and the other is the planet sustainability analysis, which, today markets are not doing. But when our thinking will evolve, it's quite possible, and in my view, likely that markets will realize that there is a trade-off between macro sustainability and Earth or planet sustainability, and they will take that into account. I don't think markets are currently equipped to do that, in part because we economists have not delivered the goods to make that analysis possible. But I think that's the direction of travel. And so I'm not too worried about the idea of issuing large amounts of debt, because I think we will be at a point where markets will realize that there is such a thing as planet sustainability. And if we don't do the necessary transition, then, it's all well and fine to be debt sustainable. But if the planet on which you sit isn't, then, you're not going very far. I would also add, because here we've discussed fiscal policy very much, but I would also add that it might be one area where the issue of debt monetization could be brought to the fore and be less controversial than it is. You could think that basically we will monetize the entire stock of debt that we issue for climate and energy transition. And this may not be inflationary, depending on what you think green and climate investment does on your production function. If you think that green and energy transition is actually a negative productivity shock, and I think there are many reasons to believe that it is, then monetizing the stock of debt that you issue to do that change could be actually entirely inflation neutral. Just a thought. Huh?
Well, it's quite a bold proposal to monetize climate debt. But let me ask a rather simple question. Namely, even today, countries provide quite some subsidies to various fossil fuel-related products. So one question is that why is it not possible to get rid of those subsidies? And the second is that economists are always talk about carbon pricing. Why can't we increase carbon prices faster? Because again, if you eliminate subsidies, those expenditures could be used for climate spending. If we increase environmental taxes, again, those revenues could be used for climate spending. So there might not be a need for more debt. We could just, restructure fossil fuel subsidies and climate taxes. So what's the three of you think about this issue?
If I may briefly, I see the point, and I agree with the logic. I think in certain areas, we will have to continue to subsidize fossil fuel precisely to exit fossil fuel. And to me, the best example of that is Germany. Germany is going to commit some 40 billion euros over the next decades to phase out of coal. So that could be seen as a cost going towards an energy source that is dying. And in fact, it's part of the enabling policies that allow coal mining workers to move and coal mining companies to exit coal mining without too much distress. So I think I agree with the logic. I don't think we'll get to a stage where we bring that down to zero. We could bring it down by a lot, but I think we will basically have to help fossil fuel industry to some extent to phase out from what they're doing. And to me, the coal is the best example of that.
Thank you. And Davide, Michal, what do you think about carbon taxes?
Well, they're definitely a part of the solution, an important one. But I don't think that they're, in a way, well, in terms of policy, they're not sufficient, I don't think. There's other measures that are necessary. In terms of your earlier questions about whether we can finance, well, why there's a reluctance to remove those financing to fossil fuels, and whether the taxation and the carbon prices can be a source. Yeah, definitely part of the solution, part of the financing sources. But two considerations. One is that, as you mentioned, there is a reluctance to, and actually, because obviously we know there's interest, there is there's the cost of the transformation, and the proposal of having a dedicated green expenditure both gives the means through the social expenditure, through the incentives, through the transformation which can be achieved through investment, to gradually, at a faster rate, change and transform the economy, so phasing out the fossil fuels, and at the same time provides the incentive. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the whole economy needs to push in the same direction, the direction of the transformation. So if that's one of the strong conditionalities for having the green debt, and you do want that because you need it to transform, that you've got an incentive to phase out those inconsistencies and that support. And true, carbon prices is an element that can provide revenues, which are definitely, as this is happening already, can be used to finance. But I don't think that that's sufficient for the whole transition. It's one of the important elements. Also, because we need to consider that the more you're successful in reducing the use of fossil fuel, the more the revenue deriving from taxing those fossil fuels goes down. And I don't think you can say that, and that symmetrically immediately means that as soon as you need less of the incentive because the fossil fuel have gone down, you also need less of the revenue. The impacts are going to be long-ranging. I don't think you can simply say, well, we earn less from carbon tax and therefore we need to spend less. So you need to find a source of revenue from somewhere else.
Yeah, thank you. Good point. In the meantime, questions are coming, and we have only seven minutes left. So maybe Michal, there is a question you might answer. So Moritz asked the question that, is it not more prudent to wait until we have a better picture of the cost of the transition, until we put in place economic and fiscal rules? So indeed, it's something similar to what Shahin has said, that things are very dynamic. So should we decide right now, how the new rules should look like? Or should we wait a longer time until we have a clearer picture of what are the costs of green transition?
Good question. I don't know. I personally, I would be. I would not touch rules for this reason. I would do everything else that we talk about, yeah, perhaps over time a clearer rationale emerges, or maybe we see that the progress is insufficient, and there might be some value added that we really need all hands on deck, or what the popular expression is. Yeah, I think when it comes to transition, thinking about proper carbon prices or even investment into new technologies, I mean, we have to proceed with that as soon as possible, and delays are dangerous and imprudent. But when it comes to fiscal rules, where I am at the moment, I'm yet to be convinced that there is a significant role. It partly, by the way, goes to the way I read politicians' behavior, and political scientists might differ on that. Maybe there are models and analyses along those lines, but in a polarized landscape that we have pretty much everywhere these days, I have doubts if sort of marginal incentives work. As an economist, I kind of have a lot of sympathy for, or understand the role of incentives and the role of relative prices in driving decisions and so on. I'm just not sure if that works in the kinds of landscape that we operate at the moment. It's not that we have a continuum of policies or we have a continuum of political preferences, and we're sort of choosing on the margin where things might matter the way the rules are set. So we either have people who are convinced that these are good things and have to be done even if it's costly, and there are people who just will do something completely different to our economies. And in that sense, these marginal incentives may do more harm than good by making the system more complicated. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, certainly we will see how the discussion on fiscal rules and whether they will be in fact made more simple, as everybody wants to, or will be made in fact more complicated. Or there might not be any change at all. Now it seems, Shahin, that your idea of debt monetization is also made some of our audience thinking about that. Now a question came about someone who did not reveal her or his name, who said that referring to monetizing green debt, why is that green investment would have a negative productivity shock, hence not inflationary? That person thought the opposite. So Shahin, what kind of shock would green investment be, and why would it not be inflationary?
No, it's a good question. I didn't say that green investment would not. I said that green transition. So to me, green transition is basically creating a double shock, a shock on our stock of capital, and a shock on our production function by basically increasing the energy cost. So basically, if you model energy transition in the simplest form, it's basically an increase in carbon pricing, which is basically a cost to your economy and therefore a negative productivity shock. Public investment and green investment reduces the extent of that negative productivity shock, and maybe you do enough green investment that in the end it offsets the negative shock of energy transition. So net, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but if we take the big picture view that transition is costs to the economy, and it must be, otherwise we would have done it, then I think you have a case for thinking about monetization without creating a lot of inflation. But all of this, I go back to my very first point, all of that is very tentative, in large part because I think the macro climate models are very weak. And so we're still very early in thinking about the economic effects of climate and energy transition. And it might be that all of that is actually supersized positive productivity shock, because we will create massive leaps in innovation, and this will actually create that's a possibility. But the reverse is also possible. And so I think I'm not saying that the case I made for debt monetization is an obvious one. I'm just thinking that's one of the options we should have on the table and we should think about.
Thank you, Shahin. Very, very interesting idea. Now we have only 1 minute left, so I would like to ask all three of you to give, basically a 2-sentence summing up. And my very last question that if you were a finance minister, what would be the really top priority that you would like to do in relation to climate change? So, Michal?
As I said, I would be in favor of EU-level action, whether it is on the revenue side or the expenditure side. That's it.
Excellent. Shahin?
Well, I would say, create a dynamic fiscal rule such that we revise the space for green investment every year, depending on how far we are to our emission targets.
Very clear. And last but not least, Davide.
I would say, if I were a finance minister, to focus on growth and make sure to reap the absolutely important opportunities that the green transition presents. So don't let older rules where the climate risks are not represented stop the progress, the growth, and the opportunities that we can reap from the transition.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think it very nicely sums up that all three of you have different priorities for the top action. Our time is unfortunately over. I think we had a very insightful discussion. So my very last word is to thank all three of you for this really engaging discussion, sharing many important points. And also I would like to thank our audience for following our event today, and in particular this last session on green macro issues. So thank you very much, and hope to see you again at other Bruegel events. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.